De niño monaguillo.
In part is because Little Richard passed away recently, but when did he pass away? Wasn't it last year? Was he a casualty of 2020?
No.
But it's also that song is very emblematic of something that I think is going on in this music.
It was 2020.
It was 2020. Yeah, it wasn't that
Yeah.
long ago.
It was also so it's the Kobe, it's the
Yeah.
it's also part of this.
Right, that's so true. That's true.
That song in particular, you know, for folks that don't know this history, you know, there were many black rock and roll, like proto rock and roll artists, right? But Little Richard was one of the ones that was there when the crossover switched to white artists. So he actually recorded this song Tutti Frutti, and it did sort of okay. And then there was this other guy, I think his name was Pat Boone. He was like one of these Paul Anka cleaned up types who recorded this song, and he sold a lot of copies because white audiences or white listeners, and especially parents, preferred that they listen to Pat Boone, and it was like non-syncopated, super cleaned up, right? But the other thing is that before rock and roll made that crossover, and then Elvis the Pelvis came in and all that, you know, boogie woogie, a type of blues, which is what rock and roll was like roadhouse music, right? And it was, and Little Richard played in roadhouses. He played in queer clubs with people in drag. The song itself was actually Tutti Frutti Good Booty, and then somebody actually changed the lyrics. So the song itself was super sexual. Like the original song was, if it's all right, if it's tight, it's all right. If it's greasy, it makes it easy. And then they actually had to hire somebody to change the lyrics. To clean it up. So I think that it's interesting because it gets to the history of kind of this tug of war between certain music as not just black music, but the black in terms of African American or Afro descendants, but also music as in the people that are the most marginalized in a particular context, right? And as a music of a kind of commons of marginalized people, and how it gets appropriated through that extraction of black music, right? Going all the way back to minstrelsy, how it gets widened. And then you have other artists, like for example, hip hop artists that try to reinvent that canon in a subversive way. And then you have kind of the popification. So there, I think it gets to this tug of war. And I think that Bad Bunny is very implicitly kind of making sure that people know that he's not there to be popified and absorbed by the market of music that wants a certain subversiveness, but also wants that respectability, right?
Right.
And the flamboyance, and the Little Richard flamboyance all the way.
Right, like because you know, and thinking about it too, like Little Richard is a gender, Bad Bunny is a gender, like they're femmes, and so also it's like this femme, this sort of like femme recognition that's happening in that moment as well, for sure.
It's interesting though because like sonically, so Little Richard as a performer is femme, but sonically what we have is a really masculinist hip hop beat, right? Like we have this sort of stripped down hip hop beat. We have what sounds like sort of the butch version of Little Richard, if you will. Like that's like the butch, like sonically, that's the butchest Little Richard whatever sound, right? Like most of Little Richard actually is sung like at a much higher octave than that. So it's interesting. And then the other thing is like what happens when we use, like someone was just saying, what Jade was just saying, when we use the Little Richard sample throughout rather than just as a hook at the beginning, is that it gives us the impression that he's freestyling over Little Richard, which I can't imagine he is. I've seen some Reddit that suggests it's a freestyle. Like, I can't imagine that's true. So just the freestyle genre itself being like sort of the way that you win a freestyle is by basically out masculinizing the other, right? By performing some kind of dominance, lyrical dominance that locates yourself higher than another person. And we see like a little bit of that going on here, right? With him being like there's a lot of ellos, like ellos no saben, ellos no entienden, ellos, like whoever ellos is, right? And there's different person throughout, doesn't know as much as me, Bad Bunny. So in some ways it's really queer with the Little Richard sample, but in other ways I think it's very much like staying within this format of like what is I think supposed to be perceived as a freestyle in a hip hop format that's actually pretty masculinist sonically.
And also even just the whole notion of a compositor, right? Like the notion of like a composition and the kind of masculinist mastery that implies as well, which is what he's kind of what he was awarded for, but also what he's speaking back to in terms of claiming his right as a compositor.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Kristie. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's just to jump off what Jade was saying. In that way, it's quite traditional. What he's saying is not at all traditional, but in that way, the defending of one's right to have a title part of it is actually quite traditional for that genre.
Right, but I also thought that there was irony in the title. Like in his title, I also felt like it was like, oh, like I'm given this sort of honor, but what does it really mean to have this honor in this moment? So I think there's like a disidentification with the compositor, like with that sort of exalted like authorship, like status of authorship. I took it to be like a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek sort of use of that, even like for the title of the song. And at a certain point, right, he almost sort of minimizes it at the end, like in a certain way, like what does it matter? But do folks know, like, so I heard something about there was criticism about him getting this award, but I didn't really follow when that happened. I don't know if this is chisme that Leslie is aware of. What's the cheese on this?
Jade knows a lot about not the cheese, but
not this one.
The person who's behind it.
No, well, no, not really. I mean, what happened was I literally looked at this morning. So
okay, yeah. Okay.
So and then it was like, what is the? So there's a couple things, right? And I want Leslie to talk and other folks to talk too. But there's a couple things, right? Which is, and I just want to kind of put this on the table. We can come back to it. But there was the whole kind of initial silence post George Floyd.
Yes. For sure, we need to talk about that.
The perceived initial silence, and the actual initial silence, plus his statement, right, that came out. So I think this is part of that trajectory as well, and it has to be kind of seen as part of that.
Absolutely.
But so I looked at the award, and the award, I don't know, it's an award that's given. There's like a ¿cómo se llama?
American, yo no sé qué.
American.
It's kind of like a lesser known Grammy type.
Yeah, and so then
okay.
There's like a Latino one, and then at the top most popular 50 songs, they give it whatever. Daddy Yankee got one, Romeo Santos,
The year before was Maluma.
Yeah.
One song.
Okay.
But so when Bad Bunny got it this year, this mujer from Puerto Rico, Angela Mayer, who's an actress, complained deeply, and Silvia Rexach had been given this award, la gran bolerista Silvia Rexach, and they tried to remove her from this because this was an insult to the award.
Wow.
Because of its and they cited over and over the line from si tu novio no te la embotoa, right?
Right.
And so they cited that over and over again as evidence of why this was not actual composition, and why it should not be awarded in this way, and that it was minimizing the power of this, what did you call it? Gente seria. Si gente seria van a dar este award.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting in the context here is that Angela Mayer is this actress who had this whole blackface character on TV in the 70s, and then she came back in like the mid 2010s with her character Chanita la Gobernadora, and had this like fake campaign, and people like a la gente le cayeron encima and had her removed from TV. And then all these other people came out in Puerto Rico, like la autora Mayra Montero, all these other people came out in defense of her. So it caused this whole moment around, and this kind of like crisis around, why are we still doing this, and why do you think this is okay? And so here she is, like, you know, really playing in and investing in the this kind of the fun that's offered by, you know, by this blackface minstrelsy, the perceived fun and fun making. But at the same time, she is now using Bad Bunny as this emblem of all that is wrong and all that is raunchy with this moment. So that's the context of that, and that's who he's talking to in the. I'm pretty sure that's who he's talking to with with the
Angela. How do you spell her last name?
Meyer, Meyer.
Okay, and
She
she's
and
what?
Silvia Resach. ¿Cómo se llama la hija de Silvia Resach? Tiene otro apellido.
Yeah, I'll look it up right now.
They're both part of like the old school artistic elite, you know, that used to monopolize television and the recording industry back in the from the 1940s up until like the 70s, you know. Like Angela Mayer is like from 1970s television, you know. But it used to be, I mean, and it hasn't changed that much, no? Es como, like if anybody knows who Raymond Arrieta is, she was like that kind of, like a white Puerto Rican that does variety shows and that includes like some straight up like crazy offensive blackface. But because it was so normalized, you know, some people still stand by it. And she's okay with that, but then si tu novio no te lambe el culo is like a bridge too far, you know?
Right.
So he's talking, when he says por Dios, señora, hay cosas más importantes, I think that's who he's referring to.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And I mean, and that's always the critique, you know, when it comes to like raunch aesthetics, it's like always, it's always like a non-aesthetic, like the sexual is what then allows for you to mark something as non-composition or non-aesthetic. So the question of respectability politics clearly was raised here, but also Leslie was sending me when Yo Perreo Sola came out, you know, these like feminist orgs in Puerto Rico that were like totally opposed to what was happening. So I don't know if Leslie, you wanna, like, if you see any connection with that and like Compositor del Año or ways we can talk about those together. Oh, I can't.
So many
oh,
levels to this.
Yes. Oh no, now I can hear you. Now I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know. So I also hadn't heard it until you sent it. It kind of got lost in the summer 2020.
Yeah,
whatever.
for sure.
And it wasn't as blown up as when he came out with Las que no iban a salir. So this was like post that. So
Right.
he's reacting to him, all the chisme behind why he shouldn't have gotten the award, because he's not a composer. So I think coming back to like him claiming his position as composer is less of a like a patriarchal or like hyper masculinist thing as it is then claiming his like aesthetic as just as important, like the raunch just as like compositionally valuable to other artists that are seen as compositionally valuable. So I think that context, the chisme context, is important. And I think so at first when I saw the video, I thought it was really like choppy and I thought that was interesting, but then I noticed that it was just like a mishmash of
yeah, there's no video, right? Yeah, there's no
that,
yeah,
but even that added like a visual to his genealogy where I think he plays with the different genres. Like he does the trap, he does the reggaeton, he does a little rock, he does a little pop, he does a little bit of everything. So to me, hearing the Little Richard didn't seem like a big shift from his usual like playing with all of the genres. But reading the comments in the YouTube video and just seeing how everyone saw his style reminiscent of like René from Calle 13, and they're like, oh yeah, it's because they became friends, so René was a good influence on him. And like being more political or explicitly political in his lyrics that isn't like the same as a politic that isn't read as already political, like raunch and perreo and sex and el culo. So I think him doing both is pretty tight. And because he's not as explicit or what is considered explicit, transparent politics, that's what's devalued. So he's saying, look, I can do all of this. I can do, the culo is as important as BLM, and they go together actually many times. So I thought that the line in the lyric where he's like, where did he say? He's like, after like señora, me dieron el Compositor del Año, pero no por aquello que sí nos hace daño. So it's like, el culo no nos hace daño.
Right.
But there are other things que sí nos hace daño.
Right.
Talk about those things. Like, don't be tripping about my lyrics.
Right.
Not harming anyone, but the harm is the respectability politics. So I think that's really cool.
So the video is not affiliated with him at all. It was cut together by someone else.
Right. Like the song actually was posted on SoundCloud, so not even on his official Spotify. And I thought that was interesting too, because if I understand his genealogy, I think like that's how he started to circulate his music. Like at the very, very beginning, it's like he would post songs to YouTube, he would post songs to SoundCloud. So to me, it was also interesting that there was no video, that it's not on Spotify. Like it seemed, I also agree, I don't think it was a freestyle, but it seems like a bit of a improvisational product, even in how it then was like put out, right? But yeah, what did you want to comment on that? Because
no, that's fantastic that there's no video, because the words on the video, right, suggest that like he's trying to fool monolingual English speakers into believing that the song is about like some kind of hard work ethic or something. It's like
I didn't notice any of that. I just was like, well, I'll just play this so that there's visual. That's amazing.
Yeah, I assume them to be quotes from him that were translated into English and just taken out of context, I'm sure in context.
Right, okay.
But no, it's really interesting. So that actually, some of what I was saying about the masculinist thing had to do with that, because the lyrics, or the words on the video are very much about him. Like, yeah, I'm just a normal person. Anyone can do this. But here's this thing I did. I'm fantastic. Here's this thing. I opened the door for other people. So one thing that I noticed a lot that I started tracking in the lyrics, but primarily because I was interested in how it was showing up in the video, and it seemed to me to be such a disconnect from the song, which is ultimately about communal struggle, right? Not like I, Bad Bunny, am the best. So
right.
I started kind of tracing the use of the yo and the ellos in the video, in the lyrics, and where in that señora, in the part where he's talking señora about the lady that criticized him, he's very obviously responding to her. But there's a good part of the song where he is just sort of talking in general, it would seem, about people that don't get it, of which she is a part. But I think I don't think that we can assume that people that don't believe he should have gotten El Compositor del Año, and people who don't understand Black Lives Matter to be a valid movement, I don't think we should assume they're necessarily the same group, but the song seems to. The song seems to assume that the ellos que critican his music are also the ellos que prefieren la mentira, que los obliga a ser mejor. So it's as though he, Bad Bunny, is improving on this group of people that is simultaneously not understanding his talent and disrespecting the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder if we could like unpack those two a little bit. He gets a little bit conflated then with activism.
Yeah, I mean, can you just say a little bit more about, like, in the sense that he's imagining that these critics are racist, or?
Well, okay, so like, or racist, but also just generally, I mean, I think the picture he paints is like church-going people who are more interested in praying than they are in actually
Got you.
the work. So, let's see. Before he switches to the end where the beat cuts out and he says, si yo pudiera cambiar el mundo, before all that, he's essentially painting the picture of who these people are. And these people are the people that se sienten a criticar los logros de un cantante. But then he goes on that they're also, sorry, I'm looking for the quote here. Cristianos que les duele la verdad, prefieren la mentira, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sense that there's this type of person that he's critiquing, and I'm just kind of interested in the way that this woman who sounds terrible from Puerto Rican television in the 70s, but becomes a stand-in for these other people.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I'm interested in that conflation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was interested in how the church emerged in the song. So like he mentions at the beginning that he was an altar boy, which I thought was really interesting. And then he said that he did that for money and like and then that he's also done other things for money. So I thought like there's a really interesting critique going on, I think, of the church that like he might not be thinking of as a sort of critique of colonialism, but I think is existing there as a critique of colonialism. So I get what you mean for sure, but I think like sort of going back to what Jade was saying, I think it's more this question of like there's all these folks worked up about my lyrics, but like why aren't people worked up about like Black people being killed indiscriminately? So for me, I feel like that's where the sort of the critique of the church and the critique of Catholicism, and he even points to like rape happening, like the church as a site of rape in the lyrics too. So I think there's just like a really deep critique of like colonial institutions and the violence that happens within these institutions that are the respectable institutions, right? Like that there is no protection even in these institutions that are supposed to be places of refuge. So he sort of references someone who goes to church to pray, but then like has to worry about the potential of sexual assault, right? And Bianca in the chat says he mentions Adam and Eve, right, with the woman, right, and this whole notion of the woman coming from the rib. So I think maybe it's less about othering less woke people, though I totally see that, than it is maybe about pointing to the violence that these institutions perpetuate and the particular power that they hold in places like Puerto Rico in particular. I don't know if other folks want to jump in there.
Can I say something real quick? I think it's also, I think the Bad Bunny that we see now was deeply shaped by what happened in Puerto Rico in the summer of 2019.
Yeah, for sure.
As a young artist with a relatively short musical history, there's been quite an evolution. Like he went from I mean, some of his early songs were hella dark. Like when Bad Bunny came out, I was like, what the hell is this? There's that song Soy Peor where like in the video, there's a woman in the trunk of a car with her hands bound up and all that. That was my introduction to Bad Bunny. I was like, what the hell is this, you know? And I think there, like he himself has evolved artistically and politically in terms of representation and what he wants to represent with his videos and his songs and all that. What I was going to say real quick about Verano del 2019, Jade and I were there, and I remember telling Jade when we were in the big freeway protest, you know, the last times that there were big protests like that involving hundreds of thousands of people in Puerto Rico were during Vieques, when the Navy was bombing. And also when I was in high school, there was the privatization of the phone company. And I remember in those marches, there was hella respectability politics. It's like the old school left in Puerto Rico with the independentistas and also the unions. Super masculinist, super como que organizado, jerarquía. You know, you have the marshals, the protest marshals. You have the men that have always dominated leftist politics. And all of a sudden with Verano del 19, that went out the window. It was like raunch all over the place. Like there was a you know, a flood of raunch politics, as you were saying.
Like as an engine.
It was the organizing principle, like in so many ways, right?
Exacto, yeah. Gaby, so Jade and I were talking about perreo combativo. Gaby just put that.
It was the engine that the rest of it could attach itself to.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
The disruptive quality of that, and as opposed to an ordered.
You had the perreo party, the queer perreo party in front of the Catedral, you know, and you had the big perreo party in Plaza de Armas in front of the City Hall, and you know the news anchor, el perreo combativo acaba de comenzar, you know, perreo combativo, like what is that?
No, el perreo intenso.
El perreo intenso.
Pero volviendo a what Leslie was saying about this kind of like overtly political position and this articulation and the kind of coalescing of a political identity, of an overtly political identity, I think is really interesting and really important. And I think that that's part of what Jose is referring to in terms of, you know, post Verano 2019. But at the same time, I think it's worth thinking about, and I think that's kind of part of what he's doing in this song, is like, where this is, like, what makes this political? Now I'm saying it, and he is doing it in a kind of René way. I mean, not to lie, it has traces. It has traces of it. Definitely. I mean, we could discuss that, right? But which I think is weird. That, I mean, I think it's interesting that like gives him a particular kind of legibility. But but also I think that he is doing something else with it, and that I think it's worth considering how and why his politics were not legible, or are less legible, if he's not kind of performing this, you know, René spitting, you know, corrective, right? This
I like
corrective,
that corrective.
That he's issuing, right? And then, so just to say that, but then I also wanted to come back to what you said, Jill, about you know, the kind of the beginning, because the beginning starts off as this sort of confessional biography, you know, de niño, y luego esto, but then it kind of like, it's really just framed as, these are the things I did for money, and now what I do for money is I write lyrics, right? Okay. So it's like it's cut, and it comes back to it at the end with this, like, this is what I do, this is my profession in a way, but also, so it ain't all that either. You know,
yeah, right? Yes, Jade. Like, and I think there's an aspect of that too, as sort of like, I did altar boy work because that was the work that I had, and I became rich by doing reggaeton, and maybe this is the only way a Puerto Rican like boy also can become rich. Like, these are the vehicles available to me. Altar boy, reggaetonero, like whatever. And so my sort of like laboring in these ways, or accruing value in these ways, are sort of all on the same plane. And it's really sort of by chance that I became this like huge ass superstar. Yes, absolutely. And so I did want to go back to like Leslie's point about the Calle 13 thing, and this idea that maybe like Bad Bunny's politics is like a sort of tutoring by René, but then also remembering how René, and I think Jose, you wrote something about like the way he did, like his problematic sort of statement he made a few years ago about, I don't know if it was about BLM or something, but just this idea that like, was the idea that he was articulating something like, well, Black folks in the US don't care about what happens in Puerto Rico, or some messy ass shit? Like,
it was a mixture of things. It started as him claiming that the hip hop industry, the urban music industry, still undervalues hip hop or urban music more broadly in Spanish and from the Spanish speaking world.
Mm-hmm.
And then he ended up saying in the same interview that when it comes to Latinos in the United States, there's no such thing as whiteness, right?
Privilege.
Or white privilege. So then a lot of people jumped on that because, you know, René has this very weird thing where René's very different from Benito, right? René's dad is a lawyer, right? His mother is from a artistic family, you know. He went to private school. He got an MA, an MFA in the University of the United States. So he has he's middle class, but he has a certain cultural capital that he's been able to leverage in his life that have given him advantages, you know. But he also denies any kind of privilege, you know, so it became this conversation about that.
Right. And so for me, it was interesting sonically to hear a reggaetonero say the word blanco. Like, I don't know if that happened for anyone else, but I'm like, I like never hear that. Like, that naming of whiteness is just not something that I'm accustomed to hearing in a reggaeton song. And right. Like what work that might do. I don't know if Kristie wants to jump in.
And another important thing about,
blanquitos. Yeah. Like when do you hear that?
Another important context thing here is that people were accusing him of being silent when the Black Lives Matter protest rekindled, you know, this summer.
Yes.
And also people were saying, there's also a lot of critique of colorism in reggaeton, which is totally justified, but people were grouping together Benito with René as saying, estos son los blancos que dominan el género. These are the white guys that dominate the genre. And I think that identity for somebody like Benito is much more difficult than for somebody like René, because Benito, 3 years ago, he was a bagger in a supermarket in this, you know,
Depressed economy.
depressed town, you know, and he comes from a mixed race family, right? So he does mention that in the song, you know, el blanco con pelo malo, is that what he said?
Algo así.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's actually something I wanted to talk about, because what struck me about Compositor del Año wasn't just the song; it was also the image that came out with the song, which is the image that we see here. So if you go to Spotify, this is what you see, and to me, it was like this this sort of presentation of blackness, of his blackness, of a Puerto Rican blackness, that I understood like this sort of like negritude shift in his work, perhaps, that we're like about to see. So like there was that critique of him not saying anything following the protest, but he had also weeks prior said that he was like going to be off social media for a while. So that was like the only reason that for me I felt like that seemed like valid. Like I don't know what hole he's under. I feel like he's in some like creative phase where he's just like isolating himself right now. But the image struck me, so I don't know where folks want to take that, but I definitely wanted to unpack the image with you all, and whoever else wants to jump in.
But I'll just start with saying that parece un cocolo in esta, like in this picture, right? The kind of like the 70s salsero.
Yeah.
You know,
Hey, we all look like that. We can't get to the barber. Everybody's starting to look like that. Okay, that's not a choice. That's how he's looking these days. Maybe the mustache is a choice.
The mustache is certainly a curated choice for sure.
La camisa a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But yes, the barber.
For sure.
I mean, it's interesting because it's, you know, the question of how this photo.
Yeah, go ahead, Kristie. Go ahead.
Oh, did I interrupt you, Leslie? I'm sorry. Oh, well, I'll just speak quickly. I think the question of how this photo reads obviously depends on your positionality, right? So, like, to me, from my positionality as like a Caribbean American in the US, I read him. So if I look at this photo and then I listen to or read the lyrics, I'm like, oh, he's on the side of blackness. Like he's speaking from the we perspective, right? Like, even though he's not actually lyrically, but he's not just allied with it. He's a part of it, is the way that this photo reads to me. But of course it depends on your positionality and what constitutes blackness, depending where you're located.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, for sure. Leslie, what did you want to say? We'll wait for your Zoom lag, babe. We want to hear you.
So a little bit, I think that his aesthetic, like presentation, however and whenever he chooses to do something different, always gets questioned. So this is where like his eligibility of consistency or not consistency is what creates like this desire to always like want to know, why is he dressed like this? Like, why are you playing with gender in this way? Like, what are your politics? And this like hyper questioning, he has refused to do explicitly until now. He's like, you know what, fuck y'all with all your questions. Let me put it all into one song and make it this hyper legible to you. Right. So I think that's where I read this song in the context of everything else. He's always questioned around like his sexuality, his gender presentation, everything. So this is no different to him playing like with his aesthetics, but this time more explicitly in relationship to the song, and kind of like aligning himself and having a stake that is less ambiguous as before.
Right.
So I think that's how I was reading this portada in relationship to that. He gave a really good interview, I think, with Playboy, around his like fashion and around his desire to like be true to his fluidity.
Those photos are so beautiful. I need to post
And they're beautiful, they're gorgeous, but it's this relationship to the audience or his fans or to those that critique him all the time that led to this song being, I think, an angry confrontation and saying, y'all need to stop. I'm a compositor too, let me be, and in this artistic way that I'm choosing to be fluid in.
I mean, and in that way we can think of him as like a visual composer as well,
Yeah.
right? Even though the he didn't make the video, but definitely in the rest of his work.
Absolutely. And I don't know. Oh, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead, Jillian.
No, Eddie, please, Eddie, bless us, bless us, Eddie.
No, I just been, thank you again. I just want to say thank you I'm so excited that I got to jump on in between grading, I'm like, like all of us trying to do so much, right? But I've been thinking something you said, Jillian, earlier that reminded me about like, with the pandemic, and there's something you said that I can't remember, but it reminded me of his billboard when he finally broke the silence, June 12th, when he says, I don't feel well and I don't think I can express myself properly. When he was finally like coming out to say something, I think like he was probably going through what a lot other folks also were going through in thinking about, right? And, what was finding the right words or whatnot, but also I remember when people, I guess I was thinking about the pedagogical possibilities of Bad Bunny, right? And I'm working on this essay right now about like Joteria studies and pop culture icons and what they can teach us about Joteria, right? Aesthetics, right? And of course you all do work that informs all of that, right? But just been thinking about like just two things, like the pedagogical, what can Bad Bunny teach us about all the different topics that you all have brought up about queerness, about whiteness, right? About blackness, but also when he wasn't responding, I was like, I was trying not to be biased because I'm a fan, but also thinking like, well, something's up, right? Like he's thinking a while ago, and then I saw that response too, right? And I've been hearing people talk about how we've slowed down, right? We've slowed down, and we're, this is a time when people have the pandemic, right? The pandemic, right? Not necessarily like the activism around Black Lives Matter, but the pandemic has slowed us down, right? And so I was just thinking about the kind of depth of his lyrics, and the way that this resembles something different perhaps than what we've seen before of him, and what the pandemic and everything going on might have, inspired for him or made him think about. And so I don't know, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I was just thinking about that, right? But again, contextualizing him, right, within this moment too of the pandemic and the uprisings y todo. So I don't know, just some thoughts that I was thinking, trying to like piece things together.
Absolutely. I do think that's a part of what's going on, and his sort of retreat into his retreat, and then realizing that his retreat was impossible because of the kind of pressure that Leslie's talking about, because his audience or critics are like, hey, like, what's up? Like, you're not going to say anything. You're not going to do anything. You just did this. Like, why aren't you doing that? So absolutely, I do think that's part of it. And I did want to hear people's thoughts on the last part of the song, where it's kind of like this apology for his success and this sort of, saying like, it was all like this before, before I was born, like, this is not my responsibility. Which to me, I felt like was unnecessary. And also, I guess, I'm trying to think of like how I want to articulate this, but like, in many different ways, we're all complicit in so many of these dynamics that we're witnessing. And so for me, it read like a little bit too much of a, like, my hands are sort of clean. But I got what he was I understood what he was trying to say. So I don't know if other folks want to talk about it.
Yeah, he actually said, antes de yo nacer, todo esto no existía. I mean, todo esto ya existía, right? He actually said, he actually has that line in there about like, you know, which is something that white America is always like, but it's not my fault. I wasn't, you know, I just inherited this, right? So there,
right.
It was like, oh, you're actually gonna say that after all this, and then you're gonna say that,
right?
It was a real weird move, and I wonder what folks think about that, and then what comes after, the verse after. That's what's most fascinating to me, that he says, like, todo eso ya existía, and then he gives, like, his advice, if you will, like, his parting wisdom, and it's a little strange, I think.
He's like, well, get people out there to vote if you, like, that, is that weird? Like, is that what comes after that?
Yeah,
where he's
I mean,
like,
so solo nos queda enseñar y aprender, vivir y crecer. Okay, like, sure, that's like, I think like 100% of people would agree with that statement, right? Like, it's not a particularly polemical statement, right? And then the next one, entender que siempre va a haber algo que nos va a doler. That's interesting. That seems a bit like, well, it's either Buddhist or defeatist. I don't know. I don't know which one it is, you know? And then he says tener fe, but we assume, of course, from the previous lyrics, it's not tener fe in God, but tener fe in the power of us to make change, right? I don't know. Like, it seemed like, he wrote the first half of the song, then he went to bed, woke up in a different, wrote those last two stanzas to me.
He just had to tack on a conclusion. That's
like all of us.
That really is what it was. That, like, really for me, of like that last part, it was like really, really good before that last part.
Except for where he says, poder ser yo, dejarte ser tú. I feel like that's Bad Bunny. I feel like that,
yes,
that is like his whole project, right? Is poder ser yo, dejarte ser tú. And then the last two lines, ese es el mejor premio que puedo tener, right? Those two lines, but the part of that precedes it is kind of like, is a little bit of a mess, and it also kind of reflects the statement that came out in mid-June. There's a
and
similar,
Eddie put it in the chat, so thank you.
There's like a similar move in that statement, I think, about that. But I wanted to come back a little bit to this idea of and I forgot what it was that set me off on it, but I was thinking about like values and the kind of slowing down of woke culture too. And I think this the like kind of resisting the woke race and lingering in reflection, and the kind of the virtue signaling that's attached to wokeness also, but that turns into value.
I like that, the virtue signaling.
That turns into value, right? But then he also talks about sus valores. He talks about me, yo sí tengo valores, eso no se expira. And that's in response to like los cristianos, right? Who supposedly have all the, you know, are supposed to be the moral, you know, high ground. But so I think there's something about this idea of what it means to be moral, what it means to have value, that is even, and I don't know if he's doing it on purpose, but it just makes me think of it, is creeping into the discourse around like, what does it mean to have political like morals, or what does it mean to take a stance on something and or stay silent on something.
Yeah, and I also think he can't win either way, because when he does try to be woke, and that's why he stopped his Twitter, people would be like, oh, like, you're so rich, like, just go back into your corner, like, nobody, you know, you're like, what are you doing with your money? Like, you know, you're fine, this doesn't concern you. So I also think like there's a lot of that resentment in the song of like, okay, if I'm woke, then you all check me because now I'm like this rich guy. And then if I don't act political, then I'm an asshole because I'm not, you know, what is it that you said, Jade? I liked it. Where was it again? The woke value, something about the woke race, not participating in the woke race, then I'm also wrong. So I think the clunkiness and weirdness of the song also emerges from that, like the impossibility of being in that position and sort of making everyone happy, which you're not going to do, right?
Well, I'm sorry. I'm like, hello.
Hi.
I wonder if you go back to what you were saying, like in the beginning of all this, of Bad Bunny being less about Bad Bunny and more about the collective. I think it was Dr. Soares that was saying that, and maybe the defeatist line being more ironic than anything else. Like, I think in any other year, maybe like the educating, the being aware of what's going on, and then doing something in a policy kind of sense did make sense of what can someone that has a lot of attention, like Bad Bunny does, do, and that actually having an impact, having like an impact on policy, having an impact on social movements. But like right now, especially with what happened with the news that broke out about like the mass hysterectomies and this being a genocide, like how much is a workshop gonna do? Like if you do educate people, if you do learn about all this, if you do try to implement like a policy change, what's that gonna do? I feel like right now in this moment, the only moral thing to really do is just to storm the ICE facilities and break people out. Like and so maybe the defeatist sort of line is more, it's not me, it's us. And we're not gonna storm in together, if we're not gonna, I don't know if I'm making sense.
You are.
Of flipping the script on all of that.
Yeah, thank you for that.
So stop looking for me to be the hero, if I'm understanding you correctly, right? Like, not that I won't do anything, but like, I single-handedly, Bad Bunny as a celebrity, I'm not gonna, yeah.
Which is the closing of his statement that he wrote, his Black Lives Matter statement, right? Is that he says, and don't wait for the artist. You got this.
Yeah.
This is not about, like, don't wait for us to lead you, which I think is an interesting, again, reflection on, and I asked the question, what is it about this, either this topic or this political moment that made him linger when he did it in Verano 2019, or with the murder of Alexa, right? They're like very immediate. It's very like immediate, urgent, timely responses, and either it's the particular gravity and bigness of the moment, or it's the topic, or it's just where he was in his life. But there's definitely like it's different, like, and it feels different.
I wanted to jump on this particular point and kind of I'll be the apologist for Bad Bunny, I feel.
Leslie, that's why I love you. This is why I love you, though.
Boy, you can give him all the kisses. Tú le puedes lamber todo.
Yeah, you know, I didn't always like Bad Bunny. Gabby knows this. Gabby convinced me of Bad Bunny because I wasn't into this trap phase. Yeah, I was not into the trap. But you know, the end of that song, after he was going hard, like da-da-da, 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 the ending felt like his breath. Like,
that is so true.
Like,
that is so true.
In this pandemic life, let's not play like we're all out here ready to go to the march, because we're all processing things differently. Don't push everyone to process the same. And I think that with what Jade was saying in terms of the woke race, like as if we're supposed to have this prescriptive like protocol to do the same thing, all of us, as if everyone processes the same. Homie can have his rest and breathe and be in his like multiple positionality of like, yeah, shit was here before me, and stop like trying to make me be the one to give you the answers of what to do. Let me have my breath. And he made that very explicit, I feel. And a lot of people in the woke race are unallowed to be that problematic, or like to embody that position of like, I feel like I may not be able to change things by myself, but hopefully in the collective, this is a process. This is all a process. The process is now public. And because my process is public and very much like widely, you know, either put under pressure or admired or whatever, it's still a process. And I think that's why I liked his kind of weird tacking on of his conclusion, because it's his process. He went hard and then he took a breath. And in that breath, he's, I think, saying everyone can embody that same like position of like not knowing what to do, or knowing some days what to do, but we're also in a pandemic. So I can acknowledge that these are the kind of the movements that I'm either mostly aligned with or not aligned with, learning about, not learning about, we're learning about too much. there's too much of a of like information overflow. Like I think that's what that song did for me. He just went everywhere. Immigration, BLM, Kobe, celebrities dying, music influences, here are my genealogies, and then he took a breath. And it's kind of, I guess, a reflection for me of saying where people are at in their process of whatever politics mean to them, whether it's an internal one, a spiritual one, a praxis, logistical one, a collective movement, organizing one, a workshop one, whatever those are, they're all necessary, but sometimes some are made more valuable than others. And I think for him right now, he's taking a breath. So let him take a breath. That's where I'm at. I know, I think there are other people in here that I know way more about Bad Bunny's life than I do. If folks want to speak, like Gabby or Renee.
Leslie, you totally convinced me.
Yeah, me too. No,
100%.
no, but and you're right. Though there is like the music stops, right? And then all you actually do hear is his breath, and he actually sounds very, very close. So Justin, you sort of reiterating that, I thought that was.
We hear it, Jill? Do you think you
Let's
could
hear
play
it again. You want me to just
yeah.
play that part? Okay.
Yeah, how it changes.
Yeah, let me.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I think just going back to Verano del 19, I think that first for somebody like him who was painted as one of the insiders, right, or the leaders of the uprising, it would have been really frustrating to be around in 2020 because in some ways it was a success, but in some ways it was a failure. Like
True.
Puerto Rico ended up with the same corrupt people in power, but rebranding themselves. And then with COVID and all of that, and with the earthquakes, like it's been a really rough year in Puerto Rico, right? So you have to, you know, even though in 2019, you know, people were putting Bad Bunny on a pedestal and Rene too, as these artists that incited this mass uprising. From the 2020 perspective, you know, it must feel really bittersweet, even though I think that there were some gains in terms of the eruption of counterculture, including queer counterculture, raunch counterculture, into the political mainstream, and like the taking over of the cathedral and all of that. But the other thing that's going on right now, and I think Bad Bunny, I don't know how he's reacting to this. I don't know if he's ever talked about it openly. Again, I in the woke social media circles, I keep seeing people, you know, calling him out as a person that benefits from whiteness. And I think right now in Puerto Rico, there is a very justified and timely conversation about anti-Blackness and about white privilege, but it's also really messy because the racial formation locally is very different from that in the United States. And these things don't translate easily, and that includes Black Lives Matter. You know, when the first Black Lives Matter happened, like in ¿cuándo fue eso? En el 2000.
2012.
Bueno, first Black Lives Matter, there was virtually zero Black Lives Matter anything in Puerto Rico, and now there was some, right? But there is a big awakening of a kind of Black is Beautiful, Black Pride movement in Puerto Rico right now. But there's even within that, there are a lot of like lost in translation misunderstandings about who is Black and who is not Black, and who has white privilege and who doesn't have white privilege. So I think there's also, I think this song and the essay or the poem that he posted is him also just processing, like, where do I belong in this? Like, where do I take a stand in? It's not that easy for somebody from Puerto Rico to take a clear stand on this. Like, am I Black? Am I not Black? Is what Black Lives Matter calling for in the United States exactly what they should be calling for in Puerto Rico? In Puerto Rico, most of the cops are from the ghetto. They're not white people from the suburbs that go into urban communities and beat people up. They're from the urban communities, right? And there's a lot of colorism and anti-Blackness, but there's a lot of history of marginalization of poor, hyper criminalized mixed race people like Benito, right? So
Yeah, and it's so funny because yesterday, she's here, but I'm not gonna put her on blast. She might just be hanging out in the background. But Anya Wallace, my collaborator.
I want to say something.
How did I know you did? Come on, boo. My love.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to come in. I'm going to turn my camera on. I don't know if you guys can see me.
I can see.
But I don't know a lot about Bad Bunny, so I don't want to offer a lot to the conversation, especially on the lyrics. But this is, I think, a good place for me to come in from the Caribbean aspect, because can you guys see me?
Yeah, babe.
Oh, so you know I'm Black. Just wanted to make sure you could see that. But what I think is interesting is that there's parts of me that wants to jump in and speak on behalf of Blackness and what I know the Black Lives Matter movement to be, but that's the American part of me. The Caribbean part of me, which my family is Bahamian, subscribe to some of these similar philosophies or, understandings about race, similar to what Jose is saying about Puerto Ricans. And it's similar, but not so much because you don't know where you fit. Bahamians, for the most part, as a culture, consider themselves Black, even though they're white Bahamians. But for the most part, the general population of Bahamians consider themselves a Black country, but they're very averse to the racial dynamics, the polarized racial dynamics of the United States. That's like a particular brand of the United States that they don't want to be associated with. So a lot of my cousins and stuff who've come over here for college, some stay and have their families and stuff here in their careers, but a lot go back because they just absolutely can't deal with the racial politics and how we do it, particularly as Americans, and how it, I guess, constricts them, and they don't understand themselves as being a part of a marginalized group, because from where they come from, Black people do everything. So I'm offering that because this, and I asked Jill privately, but this person is also in their 20s, so when you're trying to articulate your own identity, I'm kind of just figuring that out at 39.
Right.
In addition to all of these other cultural and ethnic politics that are now converging because we've become such a global, interconnected world through social media and all this stuff. That's a lot. And I don't think it's all about, I don't think it can be flattened to either being woke and conscious of, a Black Lives Matter movement or whatever, or not,
Yeah.
That's what I have.
Yeah. And Anya and I were just talking yesterday about one of the frustrations is that when Blackness is talked about in the Latinx studies context right now, the conversation becomes a bit dominated by the anti-Blackness aspect, and the frustration, okay, we can recognize that there's Latinx anti-Blackness, where do we go from there? Where does the conversation sort of extend outward from there? After you acknowledge that, then what? What do we do with that, and how does that limit the kinds of coalitions and the kinds of ways that we can understand cultural production?
And what is the anti-Blackness about? What fuels it? I think the other part of what I wanted to say about the difference between my Caribbean identity politics and American identity politics is that what you'll often hear Caribbean people say, and I'm also talking about Jamaicans are kind of have this attitude too, is don't put me in that, that's y'all, that's the way you Americans do things, but it'll come out in these really messed up sounding ways, I'm not a color, or don't put me in the categories that you guys have been constricted to. So I'm thinking about that as I listen to what people are saying about this dude.
I mean, in Puerto Rico, the classic is don't import your American, don't bring us your colonial importations of American ideas about race, which of course is super problematic.
Right.
It's a cop-out, yeah.
It's a total
Right.
And
strategy.
that was René's cop-out in that whole controversy, by the way. Calle 13,
Right.
Presidentes. That was his cop-out. That's the traditional, pro-independence left cop-out, like this idea of white privilege, this idea of anti-Black racism is an importation of the United States. We don't have
Colonial
that,
importation.
like a colonial, which is a cop-out. It's bullshit.
It's totally bullshit and annoying, but
but at the same time,
exactly.
it's the same, and it's really hard. I mean, it's just, I was gonna say one thing, if I may, Jill, about negritude, going back to that, because there's this word in Puerto Rico. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, and I'm sure you've dealt with this word in your work, Jill. The word cafre, right?
No, actually, no. What's
So
cafre?
Cafre is kind of like Mexicans use the word naco, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to translate it into English, but it's a very racialized form of calling somebody kind of a low life, low class, but it's very racialized.
Ghetto.
It's kind of like how people use ghetto, but the word itself, it gets tossed around in Puerto Rico a lot, especially when I grew up in the 80s. There, it got tossed around a lot. The word actually comes from slavery. Most people don't know that. Kafir means a non-believer in Arabic, and it's a word that the slave traders used for non-monotheistic sub-Saharan Africans that were enslaved, and the Spanish adopted it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a teenager, there was this show on television in Puerto Rico by an artist who was kind of phenotypically similar to Bad Bunny, not black skin, but with kinky hair, like some evidence that he's an Afro-descendant, but most people would not call him a Puerto Rican negro.
Right.
So, and he had this thing where his whole theme was soy cafre y qué, right?
Yeah, send in the
Like
chat. I want to look this up.
It was like this defense of cafritude, and it was kind of raunch. It was a variety show, and that also parallels the whole cocolo thing that Jade talked about. In the 80s, there was this epic, battle between the cocolos and the rockeros. And the cocolos were the ones that listened to salsa, merengue, and the rockeros were the ones that listened to like 80s American music.
It was like that in Miami in the early 90s,
yeah.
Like for sure.
It was a totally racialized thing. And cocolo is actually, originally it meant a Black immigrant from the West Indies or from the French Caribbean. That's what cocolo meant originally. So what I'm saying is that there is a kind of affective, cultural, communal Blackness that is very different from phenotypical Blackness, or is very different from the idea of Afro-descendancy, which gets tossed around.
Yeah.
And that has always been there since Spanish times. If you read all Spanish documents, they talk about the places where the prostitutes and the drunks and the bomba dancers would hang out, right? And those were the places that needed to be policed. There was always that idea that there are these spaces outside of the control of the government and outside of the control of the respectable institutions that need to be cracked down. And I think that's how I think of his negritude. I think that he's part of that whole like soy cafre y qué, and let's explore that, and let's expand that, and let's use that as a kind of center of gravity for creating a community that is not about the traditional leftist thing, which can be like the traditional left in Puerto Rico can be hella masculinist, heteropatriarchal, et cetera, right? It includes also los santeros. I saw that in the summer of 19 protests. There was a group of babalaos that showed up to La Fortaleza playing batas, and I couldn't believe it because santeros in Puerto Rico are super persecuted, right? There's so much religious racism in Puerto Rico, and that includes light-skinned Puerto Ricans that are part of that religion, right?
I always was struck by that too, because in the Cuban side of my family, there was always a little bit. It was never a claiming of Santeria, but you'd have like El San Lázaro and you'd have like La Santa Barbara. But on my Puerto Rican side, it's like nothing, you know. So like hearing this history is interesting because there was just no sort of discussion, even tacitly, of a kind of Afro, you know, Afro spirit, African diasporic like spiritual practice, like that just wasn't.
No, it's all Kardec, like the respectable brujeria is Kardecian spiritism. That's the
Right.
like the European version of it, right?
Well, I'd like to respond to Jose, something that you said earlier. That this is who I'm talking to, Jose, right? Jade and Jose are on the screen together. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. About something that you guys were talking about earlier, and perhaps this questioning from the collective to Bad Bunny on not having a response or whatever, which a lot of celebrities have dealt with, right? You know, I could very easily place this conversation on talking about anybody from Nicki Minaj to whoever at whatever moment didn't say something and was being pressed, or said too much and was, you know, attacked. But I wanted to make a distinction then about what you're talking about, Jose, with these different, there's so many aspects of Blackness that we're trying to talk about in not only this one conversation, but that you're talking about in that question, in that questioning of him for not exhibiting his wokeness. Like, how are you using your Blackness? What kind of Blackness are you okay with or connecting to? Is it phenotypical Blackness? Is it political Blackness? Is it economic Blackness? Because some earlier I heard someone say something, but like immediately what we start doing when we recognize that thing, like Fanon talks about, like the recognition of Blackness, is either trying to like determine where you fit on this spectrum, right? And then in what way? So you might hear someone say, well, I grew up poor. You know, it's not Blackness, but we know that economic poverty is a whole, you know, kind of Blackness, or ghetto, there's a ghettoization of, you know, socioeconomic poverty. So I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot in that question. And also, it's a lot to ask of a 20-something-year-old,
Yeah.
you know, performing artist.
Yeah, like crack this code for all of us.
Yeah, to crack this code for all of us that we all know there's no answer to, you know. And we know, looking at you, at least you don't fall on the spectrum of losing your life before someone thought to ask what you were, or, you know, whatever. Yeah. So
for sure,
just offering that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, to come back to what I said earlier, the statement about this was all here before the call out of the line, this was all here before I, you know, before I was born, is kind of what you're saying.
Which is a beautiful statement from a young person, you know.
I wonder what folks think about then of the intended audience for this song, the multiple intended audiences, because it would seem that it's using a racial paradigm, it's alluding to a racial paradigm that's very much, as Jose was saying, a US-based racial paradigm, right? Like when he says, he's comparing the blanquito and how he gets treated to how el negro with a pistola gets treated, right? The story that he tells is very much the story of like the blanquito can get away with it, the negro cannot, right? It's a story we're familiar with in a US racial paradigm. And of course he raps in Spanish and he's a Puerto Rican recording artist. It's also, I think, relevant that he released it on SoundCloud. I think that's worth revisiting in terms of intended audience.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering who the song is for.
Question.
You know, who finds this song intelligible? Who finds the narrative of this song compelling as a political call to arms?
Can I jump in here? I think, so it's interesting in the moment of reggaeton right now, and Bad Bunny being like one of the most listened to reggaetoneros of the moment in relationship to Ozuna and Anuel, and you know, like all these new reggaetoneros being worldwide, and the audience and the engagement with their audiences depending on the geography and who can, you know, who listens to Spanish, who can Spanish, Boricua Spanish, which is also very particular to those of us that are not Boricua. And also to, I think, something that I wanted to bring up that Gabriela put out as a resource for Latinx communities broadly to think about anti-Blackness is the fact that reggaeton as a genre is what is making visible or like articulatable, if that's a word, Blackness within the context of Latinx communities, at least in the West Coast, that wouldn't normally talk about Blackness within their, or anti-Blackness within their communities. In a way that is different from like Caribbean context. So I don't know if it's okay. I wanted to ask you, Gabby, if you're cool with being put on the spot to like talk a little bit about like what you know about Bad Bunny, because I think you know his genealogy more than I do in relationship to the audiences and like the different, I guess, youth movements in relationship to reggaeton and the way that it's like a pedagogical tool for talking about race and gender. And the way that, I'll just say it to everyone that doesn't know, Gabby put out a resource, a Spanish resource list for folks to be able to use to talk with their families about anti-Blackness, and in terms of like, you know, words in Spanish that we might not know how to translate from English to Spanish, music and different readings. So if you could talk a little bit, I think you know way more about Bad Bunny than I do.
That sounds awesome. And if that could be sent in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, it went really viral. So I think you have a perception of how folks within Spanish-speaking Latinx communities were able to take up or not take up some of the music, you know, that you put in there, including like reggaeton and Susana Baca and like other things.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm all over the place right now, but I'm really appreciating the conversation. I wouldn't say I'm a Bad Bunny scholar, as Leslie put it. I just really enjoy him. Even when Soy Peor came out, which was also my first introduction to him, I was like going through an awful divorce, and somehow that song spoke to me. But in terms of the resource list, I think so I teach Chicana studies and American Indian studies, and a lot of what comes up sometimes, mainly a lot of the work that I do is focused on anti-Indigenous beliefs and sentiments and actions that exist mainly in Mexico, right? My focus is mainly in Mexico. So a lot of my students then, once we have these conversations in the classroom, they want to know how they can speak to their parents about these topics, right? Like even just using the words, the word choices that family use that perpetuate, right? This like colonial stigmatization of both Indigenous and Black people in Mexico. Since most of my students are of Mexican descent. And so I started just compiling a lot of videos and articles and things like that, because I think that, especially with this summer, the urgency of folks like wanting to address this with their families, they're like, give me a template of how I can say everything in English and apply it directly into Spanish. But the issue is that that can't happen that way, right? Like, especially if we're talking to our parents who most likely grew up or spent a significant amount of their lives in a different country, to then want to come in and have a direct conversation about anti-Blackness and BLM in a US context makes it a little bit tricky. And I think that's what Anya, I appreciated your comments too about how there's also this perception, right, within our families of don't be applying all this gringo stuff on us, right? It's different. It's different, and Mexico no es racista, solo es clasista, right? And like that argument that, so the resource list kind of started a couple years ago, but some of the things that I do is incorporate music so that my students can also think about the lyrics and how even prior to reggaeton, there's so many other songs that speak about this that don't fit like the genres that they're used to listening to, but that their families most likely are listening to. yeah, it was kind of, I'll post the link. And I kind of lost my train of thought.
Thank you so much. But is Bad Bunny like a part of, I think Leslie was saying Bad Bunny is a part of it?
The Bad Bunny's not on the resource list, but it is, I do play it sometimes in my classes. And so I think in terms of who we're thinking about in terms of the audience, I think that there's a huge Gen Z audience that is consuming this music, which I think is interesting, right? It's a large US Gen Z audience. I feel like of Spanish speakers.
Yeah.
So I think there's something there. I don't know. I haven't really thought much about it, but I feel like that is a big part of the audience, right? Where reggaeton now is seen more mainstream as opposed to maybe 15 years ago where people would be like, why are you listening to that? Like, you know?
Absolutely.
Can I hop on really quick? I want to talk about the audience because that's like my students.
Yeah.
Probably even me. So I've been kind of like mulling this around in my head, but I think that the summer of 19 not only radicalized Bad Bunny, but radicalized his audience because they saw him with like the mask and the glasses, like being out there with the flag. And so just the imagery was very powerful. And I think that people, students, the younger generation who like love him already were like, yes, I can get behind him. I can get behind this. He's so woke, like he's amazing, da da da. And then I think from there was when he kind of came out with the Alexa, right? And talking about like trans lives and how that's important. And then he came out with his first, with Yo hago lo que me da la gana, right? And so when thinking about just like using his platform, that's when he kind of learned that he could capitalize on his platform to then move social issues forward and like talk about politics in a way that will be impactful not only for him, but for the people that are following him, which are these Gen Z young kids who maybe this is their first election. This like 2020 November is the first election. But also in the song he says, ser blanco es letal. And so within, I feel like Latin American households, we never talk about anti-Blackness. It's a very taboo subject. And so I'm wondering if his audience is this like white passing, white flesh. When you read them, when you read their flesh, they are white people who are Latinos, Latinx, and getting them to really think about, I guess, their power either in kind of the United States context, but then also within Latin America, and like what that means for them to then be participating through this way of like, of assimilation, I guess, in the Black Lives Matter movement. Like if they're not fighting against it, then they're for it. Does that make sense?
I think that's such an important point about audience. Absolutely, Bianca. I think you're totally right. And there was a radicalization that happened there when they saw him. And I don't know, like to me, this is just like where my fandom gets really crazy, but I think it's like part of my attachment to icons that I blame Catholic school for. But I think like for me, like Bad Bunny was wearing a mask before COVID. Like that actually gives me chills. Like literally.
A visor.
And then he
Too
stopped wearing.
much. It's what happened?
He was. And then the virus goes around and then he doesn't wear it anymore.
That's true. That's because he's like chilling like somewhere on the beach in Puerto Rico and some like
he's hiding out. He's not in public.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to wear a mask.
But it's just like, I don't know. So for me, there's like this beatification of Bad Bunny that I'm just like, he's, the all-knowing, you know, little young Santito, baby
Gatos.
Walter Mercado. I don't know. Like, I don't
En
know.
Puerto Rico venden los velones de San Benito.
Yeah.
Like,
Get out. I need one.
yeah.
We'll get you one. I'll get you one.
Thank you. I need one desperately.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's very intense. And I do think there's a power in that. And Bianca, to your point, so much of the fandom audience are these white skinned, whatever, phenotypical, you know, phenotypical Latinx. And there is a really important shift for sure in those conversations. And like the intergenerational aspect of Bad Bunny to me, because my attachment to Bad Bunny comes from, he uses these Boricua ass words that remind me of my grandmother who passed a few years ago. And for me, it's like listening to him is almost like I hear my grandmother. And it's just something so intense, and it almost becomes a way for me to then transmit that to like my daughter, my son, like through listening to him. So he's also like this really interesting intergenerational bridge that's also like super woke, because yeah, I want my kids to know you know, Celia Cruz, I want my kids to know Joy Arroyo, but like, you know, and there's wokenesses within there. But what Bad Bunny is bringing, like even for my son to have a nail painted wearing hella femme reggaetonero, and that's like some totally normal shit. I mean, that's just something that you can't really, like the cultural weight of that, I think is really strong.
That was like when they did the whole, was that this year? Oh my God, that was this year, the Super Bowl.
Oh my God, look at the candle.
That was so that when, you know, everyone was like, oh, we just wanted to hear someone say on national television, you know, cabrón no te conocen ni en plaza, right? Which is a very colloquial, very local specific,
right,
geography and relation and play, you know, and generation, but to have that on national television. So there's definitely like a great power in having that circulate through all these radio waves and across the internet, both sonically and through imagery as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So the intended audience of the song then is Jill. It's you know what I mean? It's the person that can understand the reference to Little Richard and to Elvis, and to understand why saying that Little Richard is better than Elvis is actually racialized and gendered in a way that's provocative and relevant to this moment. It's the person that can understand the narrative of that. I just saw the line, I was reading the lyrics. I just lost it. He's saying that my day was going okay, and then un blanquito. Let me see. Okay, los haters no se sienten, mi día estaba bonito, pero me lo dañó un tiroteo a manos de un blanquito. So my day was going well, and then it was ruined by a shot from the hands of a blanquito. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so the reason I bring that up is because that suggests that he is not a blanquito, right? Un blanquito is apart from
yes.
makeup. So it's the person who can hear that line and understand Bad Bunny racially, as neither un blanquito ni un negro, right? And that can then understand the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's quite interesting, actually, to me.
Yeah.
That because I don't think that that's the same audience necessarily of the most recent songs that he has released.
Yeah, for this particular song, I think, Kristie, you're totally right. And I think it's also a song that I think was also leveled at the industry and the Latin American sort of cultural industry that also Jose was talking about, like the critique from this actress. So I think for this particular song, it was a bit different because I didn't see it again. Like I can't even tell you how I even came across it. I think I had gone to his IG and then I think it was just on the bio, but I don't even know if a post was made, or maybe, let me look really quick. Maybe a post was made, but yeah, if we want to say the audience is for me, I'll take that. I'm so happy with that.
Or for us, we could say for
us.
Yes, for all of us. I had a comment, just kind of going off of what Bianca and Kristie and Jillian were saying. And Jillian, you mentioned about your kids, and the icons that you want to expose them to, right? Or the messages, right? Going back to pedagogies, right? And thinking about this piece I'm working on, but I was thinking about I teach a class, it's called Divas, Icons, and Revolutionaries, that, we do talk about iconicity, right? Particularly with, women of color, feminists, queer icons, right? Latinx icons. And we talk about religious iconography, and then we go into like Nicole Fleetwood's, racial icons, right? So we look at how do these celebrities or even everyday people, activists, become icons, right? Like, what is that process? How do we, and this is, other folks have written about this, but like, how are we complicit or participatory or not? And how do they sort of participate in their own iconicity? And one of the things that was really great that my students brought up was, right, because I forget what text we were reading, but they were talking about, like, I think we read an article about like loteria icons and how they can be used in higher ed, right? And they said, like, yeah, I wish that we would learn more about, pop culture icons in courses, as opposed to some of the people that we learn about that, we will forget about. I forget exactly what they were saying, right? But they're really commenting to the power of like these icons that they're growing up with and the messages that they can send them. And I was like, and they were schooling me, right, about the power, right? Like, I'm having fun teaching this, but they're really seeing even more layers behind it, because they're more enmeshed with social media and all the new stuff that's coming out, and they're teaching me about all the messages, especially in terms of gender nonconformity, right? And everything that was out there. And this was happening right at the beginning of COVID and the George Floyd murder too. So it was really a moment of like, yeah, like, exactly. Like, I think that there's more power. And this is not to, again, put all the expectation on celebrities, right? Like, and but also to see how, that the way that we see them as, I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting. And so this is part of what I do want to talk about in that piece that I'm working on Joteria studies and education and pedagogy, and like bringing in more of this kind of conversation that we're having into what's considered valuable pedagogical tools, right? In education, right? Like, yeah. So anyway, all of your comments just made me kind of think about that moment with my students, right? Thinking about Bianca's comment about, and it was one of my students that talked about Yo Perreo Sola at first, right? So
absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of this too comes from, so in November, Anya and I will have something similar to this about Nicki Minaj, which has been our obsession for a long time. Even though she's passé, we're still Nicki standing. We are still in the Nicki
not passé
forever. And so it's like a firm belief in that pedagogical power. And I think like that's in popular culture. There, and I think also young people are feeling the stakes of the weight of what's happening right now, and I think it's great that Bad Bunny could be both a source of like much needed pleasure and also like the critique that we're looking for, even when it comes out in these flawed ways. I think I'm ready to wrap things up because I'm so grateful for everybody's time. We are doing this with no institutional ties or support, just for the sake of having the conversation. And I'm just so grateful to you all, and especially to Kristie, Jade, José, Leslie for making time, and everyone. I know we're tired of sitting in front of our computers. Jade, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Sorry, I'll keep it quick, and also thank you, Eddie, for the reminder that our students and myself prefer to talk about icons sometimes than sort of somebody that even if they're historical icons, even if they're people that are from earlier generations, their iconicness is still makes them great subjects of study. But I just want to put something on the table, and I think coming back to thinking about the question of audience and thinking about some of the work that was forged by Residente, by Calle 13, in this kind of articulation of a Latinoamericanismo, and with the language and the aesthetics of reggaeton, and many people would say kind of like whitened reggaeton, but also a reggaeton that certainly allowed for an articulation of Blackness within Latinidad in this, and we're talking 10, 15 years ago,
Right.
when that wasn't happening in the way that it is now. And so I think that there is like a very interesting way, and I don't want to keep bringing it back to him, and I think he's entirely his own artist, their own artist, but there's an interesting way that it is cycling through this, particularly when we're thinking about audience and how Gabi was saying about, you know, kind of his popularity in non-Puerto Rican communities, right? And so what work is this doing?
Yes.
And in a way that René actually did, that Calle 13 actually did that to a less sort of big popular extent, but definitely had that effect. But the other thing I want to put on the table, and we can stop now, but I just want to situate him maybe even between like a René, and then also what about like Cardi B and you know, WAP and like all of these kind of raunch aesthetics there that he's sort of putting on the table and that she leans into, right? And this kind of like portarnos mal, how is she on the margins of Latinidad? How does her Blackness figure into that? Her U.S. identity. Anyway, just to situate him in that kind of like triangle there. That's all.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's super important because it is a circuit, and it is interesting to think about also like the positionality of the you know, of the Caribbean Latinx person. Like, are we that sort of you know, Rolina Joseph's book, what is it? It's sort of like the like magical like mulataje that like allows you to sort of like travel throughout culture because you have racial ambiguity. Like, does racial ambiguity allow for raunch aesthetics to accrue value in a particular type of way? And I think I would guess that it does.
And to add to that, does toying with queerness also allow raunch aesthetics to accrue value? Because I'm thinking a lot about this song. Like, this song doesn't have to do everything. It's not a critique of this song, but this is not a particularly queer song, because so much of what queers Bad Bunny is the visual, right? And so, and this song, I mean, it mentions like coming from the rib of Eve or whatever out of a woman's pelvis, but that's like a very, you know, that's still a very binary narrative. That's not necessarily a queer narrative.
It's like a feminist narrative, like, right? Like more like an old, yeah.
And I don't necessarily have a problem with it at all. I just think in terms of question of audience, again, like this isn't, I mean, like this isn't to throw away the song, but like to use the word mamabicho, right? It's not my favorite, like of all the words that you could use in that line.
He knows better. He knows better.
I think he does know better. And I think it's just something about the audience.
It was a choice. Yeah.
I'm looking for this article that Julio Capo does like Latinx history studies, and he had an article, I haven't read it yet, but it was about like, I think it's called like Bad Bunny is Queer to Me or something. I'm trying to find it because I think it would be interesting to us. I don't know if anyone, I can't find it.
I haven't read it, but it does complicate the accusations of that that he shouldn't, for those other people that critique him, that he shouldn't be the one speaking to, you know, feminist issues or trans issues, because there are folks that are very much about him not shouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
And it's like, but he's the only one telling like Anuel or Don Omar like that they're being homophobic.
That you're a mess.
And he's doing it.
Yeah. It's
well, no, are you referring to like when him and René got, where La Colectiva was like, oh, thanks, now you got an audience with the governor, and then we didn't?
Yes. They were totally right about that.
They were absolutely right, but that was a very specific, I think that was a very specific, like, we've been trying to get her an audience, and now you go there in the middle of the night and act all disruptive, and they give you an audience because you're a star and because you're a man. So I think that, so I think there's like a lot that comes out of that discourse, but I don't know that that's the whole discourse.
Yeah.
As much as it is about that specific.
But they both agreed with La Colectiva when they came out.
Or just the general, like, he's also pushing back to, it's like, I don't have to be the one. Stop making me the one. Let me be. Like, we don't always want to be the icons that maybe you want to be. Maybe you want to be in a black and white photo, but don't make me that. So I think that's also at play here.
Which is in itself a disidentification with its like masculinist egocentrism.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to bring in that paratext, right? We're supposed to remember yo perreo sola when we read this. So, we get his position. We get that he's toying with gender, that he's toying with sexuality. So it's not in the language of this song, and there's not a video to give us that, but we remember it. I think that's the assumption here.
And that this comes after Caro. It comes after him being on Jimmy Fallon. It comes after, right? All of that's part of the conversation, and people want to isolate. Or that also he's been having fights with reggaetoneros about gender and sexuality for a minute too. Like all of that is at play. But unless you see his IGs, unless you like read his interviews, you wouldn't know that. But anyway, we're running out of time.
We are. I so appreciate you all. It actually makes me happy just to see your faces. We're here. We're still here, and I'm just like grateful for that. It's a tough moment. Definitely, so much is on our minds, collectively and individually as we navigate everything. So again, I just love you all. I appreciate so much your time and willingness to have this conversation, y'all. Bad Bunny forever.
Thanks for pulling it together.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think this is, more enjoyable than a conference panel, and perhaps, and in many ways more rich.
I think so too. I'm like, no prep. We just like, look at what we did with no prep. So I recorded it. I can check in with you all. I don't know where I would post it. I do have a YouTube channel. I can follow up with you on whether you're cool with me posting it on there or not, but I'm fine either way. I love you all. Please take care.
I love you too.
Everybody.
Nice meeting other folks.
Yeah, nice
meeting folks.
Bye.
Thank you everyone who joined. Mariana, Gabriela, Anya.
Thank you for having me.
Eddie, so lovely to have you. Bye.
Bye.